Wikipedia notes that October 12th in the United States as Indigenous Peoples Day was instituted in Berkeley, California in 1992 to coincide with the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus in the Americas on October 12th, 1492. 2 years later, Santa Cruz, California, instituted the holiday. Starting in 2014, many other cities and states adopted the holiday. And in 2021, Joe Biden formally commemorated the holiday with a presidential proclamation, becoming the first United States president to do so. Because of the Monday holiday bill of way back, but not so far back that I don't remember, when Indigenous Peoples Day was celebrated this year, it was this past Monday on October 9th. But why did Berkeley, California institute Indigenous Peoples Day to coincide with the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus in the Americas? Why not make Indigenous Peoples Day some other day that wasn't already a holiday? Because it was a protest against the celebration of Columbus. But why protest Columbus? All I learned in elementary school was in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, make 3 construction paper ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and learned that he was looking for a shorter trade route to Asia. That's pretty much what I knew. But in 2019, Jillian Brockwell wrote an article for the Washington Post titled, "Here are the indigenous people Christopher Columbus and his men could not annihilate." She wrote, this year, 2019, the District of Columbia joins at least 5 states and dozens of cities and counties in replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. It's part of a decade-long reckoning with the sanitized version of the European colonization of the Americas. In the Americas, Columbus and his crew searched and searched for gold to no avail. So they filled their ships with something else they could sell: people. Of the 500 Taino they took, selected because they were the strongest and healthiest specimens, 200 died on the voyage to Spain. Many more died once they had been sold into slavery. So Columbus tried again for gold. But this time, he and his men didn't go looking for it. They ordered all the Taino people 14 and older to deliver a certain amount of gold dust every 3 months. If they didn't, their hands would be cut off. At this point, the Taino were refusing to grow crops, and those who didn't bleed to death after their hands were removed began to die of famine and disease. When they fled into the mountains, they were hunted down by dogs. Many killed themselves with cassava poison. Columbus's men also continued to sexually abuse Taino women and girls. In 1500, Columbus wrote to an acquaintance that, quote, "There are many dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand." As the population plummeted, they abducted indigenous people from other islands, like the Lusayan, to work for fields and mines of Hispaniola. When the British colonized the Bahamas in the 1600s, the islands had been deserted for more than a century. But do you remember the title of this article? Here are the indigenous people Christopher Columbus and his men could not annihilate. Yes, there was a genocide, but some survived. Christianity sanctioned much of the atrocities and killings through what has been called the doctrine of discovery. An article by Bill Chappell for NPR this year, when the Vatican repudiated the doctrine, noted that the doctrine was laid out in a series of papal bulls or decrees. The first one was issued in 1452. They authorized colonial powers such as Spain and Portugal to seize land and subjugate people in Africa and in the, quote, New World, as long as the people on the land were not Christians. Chappell also noted that the doctrine was invoked as a legal and religious standing by Europeans who discovered new lands and violently seized it from people who had been living there for generations. It has been cited in different arenas for centuries, including by the United States Supreme Court, as early as 1823 and as recently as 2005. With this history, Columbus doesn't seem like he should be much of a hero. But back in the 1980s, I was dating Pasco Shivo, whose heroes were Lee Iacocca and Christopher Columbus. And also back in the 1980s, I was assigned a ministerial mentor, Christy Orr, who told me that her name was supposed to be Helen until she was born on October 12th. And then her father, Mr. Antonucci, decided that his daughter should be Christy after Columbus. Harmeet Kaur, in an article this week for CNN on how Indigenous Peoples Day came about and why it matters today, wrote, "To understand the history of Indigenous Peoples Day, it's important to understand how Columbus Day came about." Columbus had been celebrated unofficially across the United States since the late 1700s. In 1892, President Benjamin Harrison issued a proclamation commemorating the 400th anniversary of his landing. As waves of Italian immigrants arrived in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they faced prejudice and discrimination. To combat negative perceptions, a group of Italian American elites took up the cause of Columbus Day, arguing that the contributions of Italian immigrants had helped make America the nation it was. And in 1934, Franklin D. Roosevelt designated Columbus Day a national holiday. And Columbus Day became the Italian American version of the Irish American St. Patrick's Day, the day to celebrate being Italian with praise. But knowing the fuller history of Columbus, it has been suggested more than once that Italian Americans can find a more worthy hero. Carr continues in this week's article. Inspired by the civil rights movement, Native American activists in the late 1960s formed the Red Power movement, built on principles of self-determination and cultural pride. At a 1977 United Nations conference in Geneva, Indigenous delegates from around the world resolved to observe October 12th, the day of so-called discovery of America, as an international day of solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of the Americas. It's interesting to note that that's not the way the Wikipedia article begins. They begin with the white folks in Berkeley declaring Indigenous Peoples Day, not with the Indigenous peoples from around the world declaring it. South Dakota became the first state to officially celebrate October 12th as something other than Columbus Day, calling it Native American Day in 1990. I already said Berkeley, California declared and embraced Indigenous Peoples Day in 1992. Now numerous states and more than 130 cities observe the holiday. Carr notes that some Native Americans see the day as a day to tell the history of this land from an Indigenous viewpoint. Kitty Carroll, an enrolled citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma and executive director of the United Southeastern Tribes Incorporated, sees the day as an opportunity to tell a different story about this country. She says, Indigenous people have often been erased from the country's historical record. A survey from the National Congress of American Indians found that 87% of state history standards don't mention Native American history after 1900, while 27 states don't mention Native Americans in their K through 12 curriculum. For other folks, Indigenous Peoples Day is about reclaiming power and celebrating progress. Crystal Echohawk, a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and CEO of the social justice organization Illumi Native, points to the gains that Indigenous people have made in recent years, from political representation to media visibility. For too long, Native peoples have been rendered invisible or misrepresented in popular culture and media. But Native peoples are no longer tolerating or settling for erasure, she wrote in an email to CNN. Indigenous Peoples Day serves as a reminder of the diversity and depth of Native peoples and how hard we've had to work for recognition and visibility. There is a page on Indigenous Peoples Day on the website of our Unitarian Universalist Association. In the last section of the page, titled Unitarian Universalist Association Grounding, it notes that the Unitarian Universalist Association has passed many resolutions on Native people's rights since the 1970s. In 1993, the General Assembly passed a resolution on justice for Indigenous peoples, where the UUA resolved to learn from Indigenous peoples about the richness of their cultures and about the problems and issues they face, support local Indigenous peoples' political action committees in their struggles for social justice and religious freedom, and act individually and through coalitions to respect and support Indigenous peoples in preserving their cultural pride and heritage and in protecting their natural resources. In 2007, the General Assembly passed a resolution on truth, repair, and reconciliation, where the UUA resolved to uncover our links and complicity with the genocide of Native peoples and with all types of racial, ethnic, and cultural oppression, past and present, toward the goal of accountability through acknowledgement, apology, repair, and reconciliation. And yes, we as Unitarians had boarding schools. In 2012, the General Assembly passed a resolution repudiating the doctrine of discovery, where the UUA resolved to expose the historical reality and impact of the doctrine and eliminate its presence in the contemporary policies, programs, theologies, and structures of Unitarian Universalism. To invite Indigenous partners to a process of honor and healing, often called truth and reconciliation, and to call on the United States to fully implement the standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the United States law and policies without qualification. To more fully recognize these and our many other resolutions on the rights of Native peoples, Unitarian Universalist staff and headquarters now recognize Indigenous Peoples Day as an official holiday in place of Columbus Day. Of course, recognizing a holiday and passing resolutions are not enough to repent a genocide. But there is progress. The September 2022 issue of the Seminole Tribune, the newspaper of the Seminole tribe, noted that the United States Department of Interior, led by Deb Haaland, Laguna Pueblo, has completed its initiative to rename hundreds of geographic sites across the country. A lake in Florida's Marion County has been renamed as one of 650 geographic sites across the United States that were put on a United States Department of Interior list due to the use of the word squaw, which is considered an offensive, ethnic, racist, and sexist slur, particularly toward Native American women. Squaw Pond, a remote 8-acre lake located in the Ocala National Forest, has been renamed Bumblebee Pond. It was the only Florida site on the list, but only places on federal land were on that list. The same issue of the Seminole Tribune on its national Native news page reported that Oakland is the first city in California to use city-owned property as reparations for European settlers stealing Native American territories. City leaders and Indigenous nonprofit announced the 5-acre land grant to the East Bay Ohlone tribe on September 5th. Under the proposed cultural conservation easement, Oakland would retain ownership of the designated area, but the Sogorea Te' Land Trust would have nearly full control over the use of the land for cultural, environmental, and educational purposes in perpetuity. On September 23rd of 22, the Mechoopda Indian tribe of Chico Rancheria and Chico State Enterprises completed a landmark agreement that returns the 93 acres of land known as the Boot Creek Ecological Preserve in Northern California back to the Mechoopda Indian tribe of Chico Rancheria. And in that same month, Representative Mary Peltola's election to the United States House of Representatives made history in several ways. With her recent swearing in, it became official for the first time in more than 230 years. A Native American, an Alaskan Native, and a Native Hawaiian are all members of the House, fully representing the United States indigenous peoples for the first time, according to Representative Kaiali Kahela of Hawaii. Now there are 6 indigenous Americans who are representatives in the House. In the January 2023 edition of the Seminole Tribune, it noted that when Ron Korn Sr. graduated high school in '77, he said he was among the last generation of indigenous children of Wisconsin schools actively tried to assimilate into non-native culture. Now as chairman of the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, Korn, that month, January of this year, signed an agreement with the state to ensure not only that there will not be assimilation attempts again, but there will be support for the teaching of native culture in the schools. Also, hundreds of indigenous people disinterred by archaeologists at the historic Etowi Mounds in northwest Georgia will be returned to their descendants with the cooperation of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. That's what's happening in cities and states. But what about in our congregations? Back in the fall of 2013, our denominational magazine, the UU World, reported on several UU congregations working to make amends. All Souls Church Unitarian Universalist in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, provided support to the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota Native American Spiritual Group at the South Dakota State Penitentiary by paying for ceremonial botanicals and assisting with one of their quarterly spiritual conferences. They also commissioned a collage painting by Native American artist Jerry Fogg titled Past, Present, and Future, and invited Native American author Joseph Marshall III to speak about his book, The Lakota Way, Stories and Lessons on Living, at a community forum. In Schenectady, New York, Director of Religious Education, Melissa McKinnon, led the UU Society of Schenectady into a relationship with the Haudenosaunee Iroquois people. That relationship included helping support a flotilla of more than 200 native and non-native canoeists last summer. That trip, last summer being 2012, that trip down the Hudson passed through Albany, the state capital, and on to the United Nations in New York City to raise awareness of environmental crises and to explore ways for native and non-native peoples to respectfully live together. In the Hawaiian Islands, traditional cultural practices and languages were banned following the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1893 until 1971. The First Unitarian Church of Honolulu has long supported Indigenous Hawaiians in restoring some of that heritage. Steve Losey, chair of the Congregation's Social Justice Council, said that the church is currently sponsoring the Kananukaya religious community of Oahu, and please, I don't know if I'm pronouncing all of these correctly, even though I did look up most of them, and is also working with a group called Interfaith Ohana. One of the goals of these combined groups is to promote legislation that will help guarantee access to traditional sacred sites. They are beginning the process of federal registration of more than 30 sacred sites. More recently, in 2022, in an article in the UU World, it was reported that in 2018, First Parish in Portland, Maine, invited Sherry Mitchell, a lawyer and activist for the Wabanaki people, comprising 4 independent tribes that span Maine and Canada's maritime provinces, to speak at its weekly service. Her presentation was not your typical Sunday fare. Mitchell revealed some brutal history of the Portland Church, including the story of a former minister who, along with other church leaders, assembled a posse to hunt down and kill Wabanaki people for bounties in the 1700s. The article continues, rather than hanging their heads when confronted by this dismal truth, congregation members began brainstorming potentially restorative actions. For First Parish's Wabanaki Ally team that emerged from the painful reckoning, publicly acknowledging the sins was a starting point, but they progressed quickly to allying with Wabanaki groups to back legislation asserting tribal sovereignty in Maine to correct ongoing injustices. As we learn our history from the viewpoint of the Indigenous people of this land, we begin to know some of what needs to be done to give back respect, land, rights, and honor. Native American botanist and author Robin Wall Kimmerer says, cultures of gratitude must also be cultures of reciprocity. Each person, human or no, is bound to every other in a reciprocal relationship. Just as all beings have a duty to me, I have a duty to them. If an animal gives its life to feed me, I am in turn bound to support its life. If I receive a stream's gift of pure water, then I am responsible for returning a gift in kind. An integral part of a human's education is to know those duties and how to perform them. When we know those duties and how to perform them, we will know what we need to do to repent a genocide. Our closing hymn is 1073 in the Teal hymnal.